June 7, 1971. Frank Lucas got into the back seat of his car, said good morning to his driver of 7 years, and drove 4 blocks in silence. Then he said one name, Thomas Greer. His driver's hands tightened on the wheel. That single motion confirmed what Frank Lucas had already known for 11 months. His driver was an FBI informant. But here's what the FBI didn't know. For 11 of those 14 months, Frank Lucas had been deciding exactly what his own informant was allowed to see. This is the story of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation ever run from the back seat of a car. November 11, 1968. 8:30 p.m. A private dining room at the officers' club on a military installation outside Bangkok, Thailand. The air conditioning struggled against the heat. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Brigadier General Walter Combs sat at the head of a small table, 61 years old, 28 years of service, a man whose career had been built on the specific combination of administrative competence and personal discretion that made him useful to people who needed certain things accomplished without certain questions being asked. Frank Lucas sat across from him, 42 years old. He had flown into Bangkok 3 days earlier under a business cover that would not have survived serious scrutiny, but did not need to, because the people whose scrutiny mattered in this transaction had already been paid to look elsewhere. He had spent those 3 days in a series of careful, preliminary conversations, building toward this dinner, toward this specific general, toward this specific proposal. The proposal was straightforward in its mechanics and audacious in its scope. Frank Lucas wanted to move heroin from the Golden Triangle region through American military logistics channels, specifically through cargo space on military aircraft returning soldiers' remains and equipment to the United States. The volume would be significant. The compensation for everyone involved at every level of the chain would be substantial. General Combs had listened to the entire proposal without interrupting. He had asked for clarifying questions, each one precise, each one indicating that he understood exactly what was being proposed and exactly what his own exposure would be if it went wrong. Then he said no. He said it without theater. He said that he had built a career over 28 years on never being the man whose name appeared in the wrong file, and that what Frank Lucas was proposing carried a risk profile that no amount of compensation adequately addressed. He said the cargo channel Frank Lucas had identified was real and the vulnerability was real, but the number of people who would need to know about the arrangement, multiplied across the number of separate decision points required to keep it running, created an exposure that General Combs was not willing to accept at any price. He said this was final. He stood up to indicate that the conversation was over. Frank Lucas remained seated. He said he understood the general's position completely, and that he would not waste any more of the general's evening trying to change his mind through further argument. He said he had one more thing to share before he left, not as negotiation, simply as information he thought the general might find useful regardless of his decision. General Combs, already standing, paused. Frank Lucas said that 3 weeks earlier, he had become aware, through channels he would not specify, of an existing arrangement between a different officer on this same installation and a separate narcotics network operating out of Laos. He said the arrangement had been running for approximately 14 months. He said it involved falsified manifests on 2 specific aircraft tail numbers, which he provided. He said the officer in question held a rank 2 levels below General Combs and reported, through an intermediate chain, directly to him. He said he was not telling the general this as a threat. He was telling him because a man in General Combs's position, responsible for the conduct of everyone beneath him, would presumably want to know that an unauthorized and considerably less careful operation was already running through his command, carrying exposure that General Combs had not consented to and was not being compensated for. General Combs sat back down. He asked how Frank Lucas had obtained this information. Frank Lucas said that was not the relevant question. He said the relevant question was what General Combs intended to do with it, and he said he had no stake in that decision. He stood up, thanked the general for his time, said he understood the decision and would not return with the same proposal. He left the officers' club at 9:47 p.m. What Frank Lucas had described to General Combs was, in every particular, accurate. He had spent 4 months before that Bangkok trip building a comprehensive intelligence picture of every existing narcotics-adjacent arrangement operating through American logistics channels in Southeast Asia. This was not incidental research conducted alongside his primary proposal. It was the foundation that made the proposal possible at all. He had genuinely intended the Lau's information as exactly what he said, a piece of information offered without strings, because information given freely, at the right moment, created a different kind of obligation than information used as leverage. General Combs spent the next several hours doing exactly what a competent officer in his position would do. He verified the tail numbers. He confirmed, through channels available only to him, that the arrangement Frank Lucas had described was real, was running, and represented precisely the kind of exposure he had cited as his reason for declining Frank Lucas's proposal in the first place. Except that this exposure already existed, was already running without his knowledge or consent, and was generating risk for which he was receiving no benefit whatsoever. By 2 a.m., General Combs had reached two conclusions. The first was that the existing unauthorized arrangement needed to be shut down or absorbed. The second was that Frank Lucas's proposal, evaluated again in light of what he now understood about the actual landscape of risk on his installation, looked considerably different than it had at 8:30 p.m. If unauthorized, uncontrolled narcotics movement was already occurring through his command's logistics infrastructure, and it clearly was, then the question was not whether risk existed. The risk already existed. The question was whether that risk would continue to run without his knowledge and without his compensation, or whether it would run within a structure he controlled. At 5:15 a.m., General Combs sent word through an aide that he wished to resume the conversation. Frank Lucas met him at 6:40 a.m., in a different room, with considerably less ceremony than the previous evening's dinner. General Combs said he had reconsidered. He said his objection had not been to the concept, but to the exposure, and he now understood that the exposure existed regardless of his decision, which changed the calculation considerably. He said he wanted 3 modifications to Frank Lucas's original proposal. Frank Lucas listened to all 3 and agreed to 2 immediately. The third required a brief discussion, after which a compromise was reached that satisfied both men. By 7:30 a.m., as the sun came fully up over the installation, the arrangement that would move product through American military logistics channels for the next several years had been agreed upon, in principle, between Frank Lucas and Brigadier General Walter Combs. The officer running the unauthorized Laos arrangement was reassigned within 6 weeks. General Combs never told Frank Lucas what happened to him, and Frank Lucas never asked. What made the Bangkok arrangement work was not audacity. It was that Frank Lucas had walked into that dinner already knowing more about General Combs's actual situation than General Combs knew about it himself. General Combs had said no at 8:30 p.m. because the risk profile, in isolation, was unacceptable. He changed his mind by sunrise because Frank Lucas had shown him, without pressure, that isolation was never actually on the table.